By the time you finish watching this video, you should understand what DNA is, what we use it for, why do we have it, do we have the same kind of DNA as all living organisms, what it looks like, and why we're even bothering to study it. The first question to ask when talking about DNA is, what is DNA? You can think of DNA in one of two ways. DNA is the master copy of an organism's information code, or DNA is the directions for making the different parts of our bodies. We are studying DNA so that we can better understand why we look and act the way we do. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. The D is for deoxy, N for nucleic, A for acid. If we think back to our study of macromolecules, you'll remember one of the macromolecules was nucleic acid, and DNA is an example of a nucleic acid. So a definition for DNA could be a nucleic acid that stores and transmits the genetic information from one generation to the next. DNA is important because it allows you to pass on genes, or transmit, which basically means to pass on, genetic information, so all of your traits, from your parents to you, or from one generation to the next. So answer these questions in your notes. What is DNA, and what does DNA stand for? If you don't know the answer to either of these questions, look back in your notes or go back in the video. Now that you have an understanding briefly of what DNA is, it's important to know, what does DNA do? The information coded in DNA, or held in DNA, has directions that our bodies need to make us look and act the way we do. DNA instructions are a genetic code, which means that when new cells form, they have a copy of DNA passed down from their parent cells. And it's an exact copy. We talked about this process during the cell cycle. But just for review, think back. Where is DNA stored in a cell? Hopefully you remember from cell biology, DNA is stored in the nucleus. Looking into more detail of what DNA does, each of us gets different DNA from our parents, which is what makes us different from each other. It gives us traits like our hair color, our eye color, our blood type, whether we make all the necessary enzymes to digest our food. It also gives us the number of fingers in our hands. So for example, most people have 5 fingers, but some people have 6. It's a genetic disorder called polydactyl. And if you have one gene passed on to you through DNA from one parent, you actually get a 6th finger because it's dominant. It actually could cover up just having 5. It's our DNA, or our genes, that stores this information and makes it show up the way it does. Other important facts to keep in mind about DNA is the more related two organisms are, the more like their DNA is. So for example, the DNA in you is more like the DNA in your mother than the DNA is to that of a classmate. You could also think of it as the DNA in a cat and a tiger is more similar than it is between a tiger and a flower. Now that we've talked about what DNA is and what it does, we're going to talk about the structure of DNA. Remember from previous videos the difference between structure and function. Structure is what something looks like, and function is what something does. The structure of DNA is it's made up of 2 strands of nucleotides, which is a vocab word we talked about previously, that form a structure that looks like a twisted ladder. And this structure is called a double helix. So the twisted ladder, or what's shown over here, is known as a double helix, and that's the structure of DNA. It has 2 strands, so 2 sides, which is going to be important later on. Recall from Unit 1 that DNA is made up of nucleotides. The monomer of nucleic acid is a nucleotide. A nucleotide is made up of a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogen base. There are 4 different nitrogen bases that can be attached to the phosphate and sugar group. So we talked about the phosphate and sugar, and this nitrogen base, or nitrogenous, which just means it contains nitrogen, can have 4 different things attached to it. The 4 nitrogen bases are called adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. Usually they're abbreviated adenine A, guanine G, cytosine C, and thymine T. Looking at what these molecules look like, adenine and guanine, if you look over here, have 2 rings. So they have this ring and this ring in both cases. They are known as purines. On the other hand, thymine and cytosine only have 1 ring and are called pyrimidines. We'll talk about why that's important when we talk about the structure of how DNA fits together. DNA base pairs, which means it has 2 complementary strands. Across from every A is always the letter T, and across from every G, or guanine, is always cytosine. So going back to our diagrams of what these molecules look like, think about why A would pair with T and G would pair with C. You can see why they base pair the way they do if you look at what happens if they pair wrong. So A, which is made up of 2 rings, and G, which is also made up of 2 rings, if they base paired next to each other, would make 4 rings across. But then, if at the same time C was pairing up with T, and they're both single rings, it would only be 2 rings across. This would not give a very solid structure because there would be no way to connect these. It would have to go in and be crooked. But if A always pairs up with T, and G always pairs up with C, the DNA molecule is always 3 rings across, and now it fits perfect. It's completely even and gives a solid structure. So if we look at this in the case of DNA, what are we talking about? We're talking about the fact that when you find an A and you look at what it's attached to, it's always attached to a T. If you find a G, you look at what it's attached to, it's always attached to a C. Okay, we're going to cover a couple quick things about structure and then be done. Structure of DNA. Looking at it now that we've talked about the phosphate, sugar, and nitrogen bases. Zooming in on one section would look like this. You have your phosphates on the side, they're the yellow circles. You have the sugar, and then you have your A's, your T's, your C's, and your G's, the nitrogen bases, base pairing. When describing the structure of DNA, a lot of times people refer to the phosphate and sugar groups as a sugar-phosphate backbone. So on either side, you have a sugar-phosphate backbone. And you can think of the nitrogen bases, if this is a ladder, as the rungs of the ladder. The last important thing about DNA structure is we have our sugar-phosphate strong backbone, and along this strong backbone there are some things called strong bonds. So between every phosphate and sugar, they are connected by very strong bonds or very strong attachments. Think of it as crazy glue. On the other hand, the nitrogen bases, or the A's, T's, C's, and G's, are connected by very weak bonds. So these dotted lines represent weaker bonds. Think of it as the backbone is connected by crazy glue, and the weak bonds are connected by Dollar Tree glue sticks. It's very weak, it's easy to break it apart. This is not super important now, but as we get into more detail about molecular genetics, it'll become important for the rest of the stuff we're going to be talking about. Alright, so we're done, and now I want you to answer some check yourself questions. Starting with, how many strands of nucleotides make up DNA, and the 2 strands have to bond together. What nucleotides bond together? Answer these questions in your notes. Next, try these two. What are the 3 parts of a nucleotide? What are the 4 nucleotides that make up DNA? Finally, what is the structure of DNA called? How is genetic information stored in DNA? True or false, all organisms are made up of the same 4 nucleotides. And true or false, more similar or alike two organisms are, the more genetic patterns they have in common. Once you finish answering these questions, you're done with the video. If you can't answer any of these questions, go back and watch it again.